in less than 2 years. One Confederate ship turned the world's oceans into a war zone for Northern merchants about 65. Union vessels captured, burned, or sent to the bottom. Not in one battle, not in one region, but across shipping lanes that stretched from the Atlantic into the far reaches of global trade, while the most powerful navy in the Western Hemisphere chased her like a man chasing smoke. That's the part that sounds like exaggeration until you look at the map and realize the Civil War did not stay inside America's borders. It leaked into insurance markets, foreign harbors, and the decision-making of captains who had never set foot in Virginia mud. The ship was the CSS Alabama, and the mind behind her was Raphael Semmes, a former U.S. Navy officer who flipped his loyalty, then learned how to hurt the Union where it felt safest, in the bloodstream of commerce. The Alabama story starts with a problem the Confederacy couldn't solve the normal way. The Union could build ships by the dozen, enforce a blockade, and choke southern ports with industrial weight. The South could not outbuild that, so it chose a different weapon: commerce, raiding fast cruisers that didn't need to win fleet battles, only to hunt merchantmen, raise fear, and force the Union to spread its naval power thin. And the best place to build a fast cruiser was not in a Confederate yard that barely existed. It was overseas, in a world of neutral laws, polite denials, and shipbuilders who understood money better than politics. In 1862, a sleek hull slipped into the water from a British yard under an innocent name and an innocent surface story. On paper, she was just another vessel. In reality, she was a purpose-built predator. She would later be remembered as built in Britain. But that phrase hides the real magic trick. She was built in a legal fog thick enough to sail a war through. Those early days were less about cannons and more about timing delays. Paperwork, quiet signals, the race between diplomatic pressure and a ship's ability to leave port before anyone could stop her. When she finally escaped to sea, she did it the way a good raider begins, not with a fight, but with a clean vanishing. Then came the transformation. Offshore, far from the eyes of courts and officials, she was armed, supplied, and commissioned into Confederate service. A ship becomes dangerous not at launch, but at commissioning, when the crew's purpose hardens and the captain's intent becomes law. Semmes built that crew out of men willing to live by motion. Months at sea, unfamiliar waters, no safe home port, and the knowledge that if you slow down, you die. He also understood theater because commerce raiding is partly performance. A burned ship is a message that travels farther than a captured one. The first captures establish the rhythm. A suspicious sail appears. The Alabama closes distance with unsettling calm. Flags go up. A warning shot, or sometimes not even that, because the threat is already understood. A boarding party climbs aboard the merchant ship, checks papers, confirms nationality and cargo, then makes a decision that feels like a ceremony. Remove the crew, take useful supplies, and set the prize on fire. Flames climb rigging. Smoke spreads across open water. The horizon learns a new kind of weather. Semmes often avoided unnecessary killing, not because he was gentle, but because a raider who spares lives creates witnesses, and witnesses create fear that multiplies the next capture. Survivors tell the story in port. The speed, the calm, the moment their ship became a torch. Insurance companies hear it. Newspaper offices hear it. The Union Navy hears it, and by the time it reacts, the Alabama is already gone. That's why the chase felt impossible. The ocean is a desert with no roads. A warship can patrol a lane, but a raider doesn't need a lane. It needs opportunity. The Alabama lived on opportunity. She moved where trade moved, and trade moved everywhere. Semmes hunted the soft targets because soft targets are what keep a nation's economy breathing during war. Every ship he destroyed represented cargo lost, money lost, schedules shattered, and a captain somewhere thinking twice before sailing again. That hesitation was part of the damage. In the North, investors didn't only fear losing vessels. They feared losing predictability. In war, predictability is a hidden form of security, and the Alabama attacked it relentlessly. Rumors began to outrun official reports. Alabama off Cuba, Alabama near Brazil, Alabama heading for Africa. Some of those rumors were wrong, but wrong rumors still work if they change behavior. Merchants rerouted. Some sent ships under foreign flags. Some stayed in harbor longer. Some paid higher premiums and passed the cost along. Semmes was doing strategic work with matches and paperwork. The Union Navy, forced to protect blockade duties and hunt raiders at the same time, faced a brutal choice: divert ships to chase him and weaken the blockade, or keep the blockade tight and accept the bleeding of commerce. That dilemma is why the Alabama became more than a ship. She became a moving argument that the Union could win battles on land and still look vulnerable on the world's oceans. And as 1862 turned to 1863, the Alabama's crews began to feel less like a raid and more like a global campaign, one that would soon include a moment. That proved she wasn't just burning defenseless vessels, she could fight and win against a Union warship too. A moment that fed her legend and made the Navy's embarrassment impossible to dismiss. The Union liked to describe Confederate raiders as pirates, because pirate is a word that makes a threat feel criminal instead of strategic. But the Alabama's campaign was too organized, too methodical, too geographically ambitious to fit that comfort. Semmes ran his ship like a roaming system, gather intelligence in ports, intercept trade where it thickened, strike fast, and then vanish into the world before the Union could clamp down. In early 1863, off the Texas coast near Galveston, he met a Union warship, the USS Hatteras. And the encounter mattered because it shattered the idea that the Alabama was only brave against unarmed merchants. The Hatteras approached, suspicious, expecting an easy stop. The Alabama lured her out and then hit with controlled violence. In a short, sharp fight, the Hatteras went down, and the Alabama rescued survivors. That single act, sinking a Union warship and preventing a massacre afterward, created a complicated public picture. A Confederate raider who could kill you efficiently and still keep you alive once you were helpless. It also fueled the myth that Semmes was untouchable because he could win and then disappear again. After that, the Alabama's voyage widened. She worked the Atlantic, the Caribbean approaches, and then pushed into the South Atlantic, where shipping routes were rich and Union patrol coverage thinner. Off Brazil, she found a kind of hunting ground that made her name echo, merchant ships moving with the confidence of distance from the main war, and then suddenly realizing distance was not protection. One after another, the Alabama stopped them, stripped them, burned them. The pattern itself became terror. Captains began scanning horizons with the nervousness of men expecting a predator. Some crews whispered that you could smell her before you saw her, smoke and salt and something metallic, the imagination turning fear into senses. Newspapers amplified that fear with every fresh report. Insurance rates rose. Investors complained. The U.S. government grew more aggressive in its diplomacy because everyone understood the uncomfortable truth. A huge navy cannot be everywhere at once, and a fast raider only needs to be somewhere at once. Semmes exploited that. He didn't concentrate on one region long enough to be trapped. He kept moving, and movement was his camouflage. The Alabama also depended on coal and maintenance, which meant she existed partly inside neutral laws. A raider that cannot refuel is a raider that dies. Semmes learned the world's ports the way a thief learns neighborhoods. Where you can enter, who will look away, what you can buy quickly, what questions you must not answer. Neutrality in the 19th century wasn't a clean moral stance. It was often a practical arrangement, and the Alabama surfed the edge of that arrangement. There were ports where she could anchor legally, take on coal, and let her crew taste land without being arrested. While Union diplomats fumed and Union captains paced outside limits they couldn't cross. Every time the Alabama used a neutral port successfully, it felt like a loophole turned into another burned ship. Yet even legends collect wear. Months at sea foul a hull and steel speed. Rigging phrase. Boilers tire. A ship that once leapt forward begins to feel heavy. By 1864, the Alabama had done extraordinary damage, but she was not fresh. She was famous, hunted, and aging. Semmes faced a campaign reality that every raider eventually faces. You can run forever only until your own machinery says no. He needed repairs that could not be done with quick work on open water. He needed a harbor that could help a warship without officially helping a warship. He chose Cherbourg, France. It was a gamble because a neutral port is safety only as long as you can leave when you want. Once the Alabama entered Cherbourg, her story became a waiting game. The Union had chased her for nearly 2 years, and now at last the chase had a fixed point. A Union ship, USS Kearsarge, arrived outside the harbor mouth and held position beyond the line of neutrality like a man camped outside an enemy's house, refusing to blink. The Kearsarge couldn't sail in and attack without causing an international incident. But she could do something just as deadly. She could turn time into a siege weapon. Every hour the Alabama stayed inside, her supplies shrank and her myth cooled. Every day more people learned where she was. Spectators started to gather along the French coast, drawn by the promise of a historic duel. Suddenly the Alabama's next move wasn't just a naval decision, it was a public act. Semmes understood the trap. If he stayed, his legendary ship would be trapped by paperwork and diplomacy until she became a museum piece or a surrendered trophy. If he sailed, He would either break free and revive his myth, or die in a way that still wrote a headline worthy of his campaign. He chose to sail because a commerce raider lives on momentum and reputation dies in quiet captivity. Meanwhile, the Kearsarge prepared with the patience of a hunter that believes the prey has no other door. Her guns were ready, her crew drilled, and she carried a secret advantage that was not glamorous but was brutally effective. Heavy chains hung along her sides. Concealed beneath planking, a crude armor that could absorb or deflect incoming fire. It wasn't the sort of thing that belongs in a romantic painting, but war is often decided by unromantic improvisations. On the morning of June 19, 1864, the Alabama steamed out of Cherbourg, escorted to the edge of neutral waters, and crossed the invisible line where law ends and physics begins. The sea was calm enough to feel like mockery, the coastline filled with eyes, and as the two ships came into range, the world waited for a question that felt larger than a duel. Could the ghost ship that burned 65 Union vessels escape again, or would the Union finally drag the legend down into cold water in front of witnesses? The first shot sounded almost ordinary, which is what makes naval combat terrifying: enormous violence delivered with the steady rhythm of trained men doing their jobs. The Alabama opened fire at long range as the ships began circling, each captain trying to hold the angle that favored his guns, while the water between them filled with smoke bursts and the sharp crack of shells cutting air. From shore it looked like theater. From deck it was pure mechanics. Powder passed hand to hand, rammers driving charges, gunners squinting through drifting haze, metal vibrating under every discharge. The ships moved in widening circles, not because it looked dramatic, but because circling helped maintain a firing solution and limited how long one side could expose a vulnerable flank. SEMS needed accuracy and damage quickly because time favored the fresher ship. The Alabama, after months at sea, carried the exhaustion of her own legend. Her hull had endured the slow punishment of salt and distance. She had come to Cherbourg for repairs for a reason. The Kearsarge, by contrast, was a purpose-built hunter, well-supplied, well-prepared, and commanded by a man who had waited long enough to be patient. And then the duel began to reveal its imbalance. Some Alabama shots struck, but not with the decisive effect SEMS needed. In combat, small technical weaknesses become fate. A shell that fails to explode, a shot that hits at the wrong angle, a moment of smoke that hides the true range. The Kearsarge's return fire was controlled and increasingly brutal. Her heavier guns found the Alabama's hull with a deep, sickening impact that sailors feel not only in their ears but through their feet, as if the ship itself is being punched from the inside. Splinters flew, iron tore, men fell who never even saw the projectile that killed them. When a shell hits wood at speed, it turns wood into shrapnel, and the deck becomes dangerous even when you are not directly struck. As the ships kept circling, the Alabama's vulnerability began to show in her behavior. She started to slow. She began to list. Those are the subtle signs that the sea recognizes as the beginning of the end. Water doesn't destroy a ship all at once. It enters through wounds and then steadily eats the vessel from within. Pumps fight, men fight, time fights harder. The Kearsarge's hidden chain armor began to matter too. Alabama shots that might have done catastrophic damage were blunted or deflected, and the realization that your enemy is tougher than you expected arrives in the worst way. You feel it in how long he remains steady while you are becoming wounded. SEMS kept firing and maneuvering, trying to close for more effective range because he needed a turning point. But the Kearsarge's gunnery tightened as the duel progressed, and that tightening is how a professional kill looks. Less frantic, more certain. The Alabama's internal spaces started to flood. Her steering and engines suffered. The ship's motion became heavier, less responsive, as if the ocean itself had grabbed her ankle. Through smoke and chaos, the crew fought with the discipline of men who understood the stakes of captivity and the humiliation of surrender. They were no longer burning merchantmen with calm ceremony. They were fighting to keep their own deck from becoming a sinking platform. SEMS, whatever you think of him, was not a man who surrendered easily, because surrender would collapse the psychological weapon he had wielded for 2 years, the idea that he could always slip away. But legend cannot plug holes. As the Alabama took punishment, the moment arrived that every captain dreads and recognizes, the moment you know the ship is no longer yours. It belongs to the water now, and you are only negotiating the terms of how it will take her. SEMS raised a signal of surrender, and the Alabama's guns began to fall silent. Even then, the end wasn't clean. A warship sinking can become a massacre if rescue is delayed. And on that June morning, men spilled into the sea as the Alabama's hull dropped lower. Lifeboats went down. Debris floated. The Kearsarge, despite being the enemy, moved to rescue survivors, because in naval warfare there is an old code that sometimes survives politics. You save drowning men when you can, but there were too many men and not enough time, and the Alabama sank quickly enough to turn rescue into chaos. Then came the twist that turned victory into controversy. A British yacht, the Deerhound, hovered near the scene and began picking up survivors, including Semmes himself. To the Union, it looked like escape under a neutral flag, a final slip through the fingers after 2 years of chasing. To Semmes's supporters, it looked like providence and cleverness, the raider still finding a loophole even as his ship vanished beneath him. Either way, it fit the Alabama's myth. Even in defeat, the story refused to be simple. The ship that had burned about 65 Union vessels went down off Cherbourg in roughly an hour-long duel, the sea swallowing her as spectators watched from shore, the smoke thinning, the water calming, and then that quiet horror of open sea after violence. No trenches, no ruined town, just a patch of ocean that looks innocent again the moment the last mast disappears. As for the Union Navy, the duel was catharsis. The ghost ship was finally dead. For the Confederacy, it was the loss of a floating symbol that had embarrassed a stronger enemy across the world. But the Alabama's real damage had never been in her final fight. It was in the 2 years before it, in the decisions she forced. Ships rerouted, cargo delayed, premiums spiking, patrols stretched, public confidence shaken. And that is why the Navy couldn't stop him is both true and misleading. The Navy did stop the ship, but it could not stop what the ship had already done to the psychology of commerce. And as survivors drifted toward rescue, the Alabama's campaign began turning into something even harder to sink than a cruiser, an argument about neutrality, responsibility, and the idea that a war can be fought on a battlefield you never see on a classroom map. The Alabama's sinking ended the chase, but it did not erase the consequences. Because the most powerful weapon the Alabama carried was never her cannon. It was uncertainty. In a land war, a front line tells civilians where danger is. At sea, the front line moves. And Semmes weaponized that mobility until trade itself felt hunted. The numbers mattered, around 65 Union vessels captured or destroyed, plus the shock of a Union warship sunk early in the cruise, but the deeper damage lived in second-order effects. Ships sailing under foreign flags to avoid being targeted. Northern merchants rerouting cargo, insurers raising rates, and politicians having to answer an ugly question from ordinary people who didn't care about naval theory. Why can't we protect our own ships? That question nags because it hits pride, and pride is a strategic resource in a democracy at war. The Union Navy was never helpless. It enforced a blockade that steadily tightened and contributed decisively to Confederate collapse. It hunted raiders. It won duels. But the Alabama forced the Navy to play 2 games at once, and in doing so it exposed a truth about power. Dominance in aggregate does not guarantee control in every moment. A fast raider only needs to be lucky and well-handled repeatedly for a stretch of time to create the illusion of omnipresence. An illusion can be as damaging as reality if it changes behavior. That's why the Alabama's story became so viral even in its own era. It was a narrative that fit on a single striking image. A merchant ship on fire, crew lined along the rail, the raider slipping away into haze. People understood it instantly. People spread it instantly. Semmes also understood the difference between terror and slaughter. By sparing crews when possible, he turned victims into messengers. A killed crew disappears. A rescued crew arrives in port with a story that makes other captains nervous. That nervousness raises costs and slows decisions, and slowing decisions in wartime is damage. Even the duel at Cherbourg played into this logic. It wasn't fought in secret. It was fought in sight of land, in sight of neutral observers, in a place where newspapers could report every detail and artists could paint the circle of ships and turning smoke. That publicness mattered, because the Confederacy's naval strategy was partly diplomatic theater proof to foreign watchers that the South could still project force, that the Union's control wasn't total. When the Kearsarge sank the Alabama, the Union won the theater that day. But the existence of the theater at all proved the Confederacy had succeeded in exporting the war's anxiety. The Alabama's end also dragged international questions into the open. How does neutrality work when a belligerent ship is built abroad, then armed outside jurisdiction, then uses neutral ports to coal and refit while being hunted by an enemy that must respect legal lines? Those questions did not die with the Alabama. They grew because the Union had a long memory for economic damage and international loopholes. After the war, claims about losses caused by Confederate raiders built in foreign yards escalated into an international dispute that eventually became famous in its own right, pushing the idea that neutral powers can be held responsible if their neutrality is only paperwork while their shipyards produce weapons for one side. That legal afterlife is important because it shows the Alabama's war did not end in 1864. It simply changed form from fire on the horizon to arguments across courtrooms and treaties, from sailors watching flames to diplomats calculating damages. Meanwhile, Semmes' personal story fed the legend further. He did not end the war in a Union cell. He escaped aboard the Deerhound, reached safety, and later rejoined Confederate service, adding another chapter to the idea that the raider always found a gap. That escape infuriated Northern observers precisely because it felt consistent. Even in defeat, he slipped away through neutrality's seams. But step back and look at the broader meaning. The Alabama did not change the Civil War's outcome. The Union's industrial power and blockade, combined with battlefield victories, still ground the Confederacy down. What the Alabama changed was the feeling of inevitability. She demonstrated that a weaker side can still impose costs by targeting systems rather than armies, and that global commerce can be attacked without holding territory. In modern terms, she was an early example of economic warfare that understands attention, fear, and friction as targets. That's why the Alabama's story still hooks people today. It's a one-ship version of an uncomfortable lesson. You can be stronger and still be made to look vulnerable if your opponent chooses the right battlefield. The Navy could not stop him quickly because there was no single place to stop him. The ocean offered him anonymity and options, and each option cost the Union time. By the time the Kearsarge finally forced the duel, the Alabama was worn and cornered. And even then the finale contained escape and controversy. It was the perfect story engine, a shadow ship, a globe-spanning chase, ships burning like signal fires, a duel before spectators, a sinking, and a captain who slipped away. And beneath the drama was the real, grounded truth that makes the story matter. Commerce is a nation's bloodstream. And the Alabama proved you can bleed a stronger enemy by cutting small arteries repeatedly until everyone feels the weakness. That is what "they couldn't stop him" really means. They stopped the ship. Yes, but for 2 years they could not stop the damage that fear and fire were doing to the Union's sense of control. And in war, there are few humiliations sharper than realizing your enemy can reach out across the world and make your people doubt the safety of the horizon.